The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Cristina Bolling from the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. Today, we've got a history-themed episode for you, centered around a big anniversary of local significance, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, or the Meck Dec, which happens on May 20th. The Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence is a big topic of conversation around Charlotte. Some people are skeptical about its story because it's largely based on recollections recorded decades after the fact. There's no hard copy of the Meck Dec to prove its existence. But one thing is clear. The enduring debate helps draw people into a better understanding of the area's history. And so it's in that spirit that we recently gathered 3 local experts to talk about the Meck Dec for a panel discussion at the Sharon at SouthPark retirement community. We recorded the conversation for this episode of the podcast. So let's get into it.
I will go first. I'm Kendall Kendrick. I am the executive director of the Charlotte Trail of History. I'm also the director of the Charlotte Liberty Walk, which is our sister site, which is in Uptown Charlotte. And related to what we're going to be talking about today, I am the chairperson for Mecklenburg 250, which is actually the official committee of Mecklenburg County, so the government's committee. We have a lot of people doing a lot of things for this big 250th anniversary coming up in just a couple of weeks here. So, yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Short. I'm a freelance writer and contributor to the Charlotte Ledger. I've written a history series for them. I have very few Meck Dec bona fides other than having read Scott's book 2 or 3 times. So that's kind of the extent of my research. So he's the primary source for that. But big fan of the story. I think I'm here because I'm a bit of a kind of Meck Dec legend or fact evangelist. So I like kind of telling the story. I think it's important to the history of Charlotte for everybody to kind of know and understand and be able to talk about the story, because I think it's a really cool one.
And I'm Scott Syfert. I'm the one of the co-founders of what's called the May 20th Society, which I'll tell you all about here in a second. I'm also the chairman of the Trail of History Board, which erects the bronze statues on the Little Sugar Creek Greenway. And Kendall's our executive director, she mentioned. So that's me. You want me to start with a little overview of Meck Dec, or
yes, that would be
go
great.
Back to you?
So no, let's have you, Scott, just kind of set the table for what you can stand right there. What Meck Dec is, why we talk about it so much, why it's important.
Okay, great. I'll do that. So we'll do Meck Dec in 15 minutes. Go. So as I say, I started with a number of other colleagues, the May 20th Society, about 20 years ago now, which is a little alarming to me. But we had heard about this Meck Dec story, and a friend of mine had told me about it. And like many people, when they first hear it, including Thomas Jefferson, thought, you're making this whole thing up. There's no way this is true. How Mecklenburg County had been the first to declare independence from Great Britain in May of 1775, and that it had been a city and county holiday for many years, and that American presidents had visited Charlotte many times to celebrate it and so forth, and it had a rich tapestry of history in the county. And I, having grown up in Charlotte and gone through the school system for whatever reason, had never heard of this, or if I had, it would have been like in passing in school. So like most rational people, I thought, there's no way this is true. And he said, no, it is. So we started this group called the May 20th Society, really as a young professionals organization. We just thought it was a cool sort of booster story, but none of us were historians. We were just kind of interested in the thing. But as that project grew, we've done a number of things since. We have done the Charlotte Liberty Walk, which Kendall alluded to, which is the uptown walking tour of Revolutionary War sites. We helped fund and sponsor the Captain James Jack statue, which you see here on the Greenway. And we've most importantly perhaps done the Captain James Jack Pilsner at Old Mecklenburg Brewery. That's going to be our legacy that will live on forever. So we'll skip over that. So the basic Meck Dec story is, in May of 1775, in the small crossroads town is a generous, more like a little hamlet of 10 to 20 buildings, log cabins mostly. The Scots-Irish Presbyterian militia leaders are meeting at the courthouse in downtown Charlotte, which you see here in the middle of what's now Trade and Tryon Street, when they receive word that the battles of Lexington and Concord have occurred exactly 1 month before. and they go completely ballistic. And over the course of 24 hours, they debate and resolve upon a series of resolutions, which we now call the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. As one of the participants in the meetings recalled, he said, "We smelt and felt the blood and carnage of Lexington, which raised all the passions into fury and revenge." And so they declare, allegedly, independence from Great Britain in this document called the Meck Dec. Well, what do you do then? So they said, well, we're not sure what to do next. Let's send these to our congressional representatives who are meeting in Philadelphia and have them tell us what to do next. So they do. So they give these resolves to a local tavern owner named Captain James Jack, which you see here, and he rides to Philadelphia in June of 1775 to deliver these to Congress. And here he is riding up North Tryon Street. Congress, however, is debating a series of pro-peace resolutions with the British called the Olive Branch Petition. And so they think this is very premature. We're not interested in this right now. And they send Jack home. Thank you, but no thank you. The British, meanwhile, have heard what's going on in Mecklenburg County. The last royal governor of North Carolina, Josiah Martin, writes to his superiors in London that the resolves which your lordship will find in this newspaper surpass all the horrid and treasonable publications that the inflammatory spirits of this continent have yet produced. So the British are aware that this is happening. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary War sort of wipes out all of this history in Charlotte. The British occupy Charlotte 5 years later, in September, October 1780. Most of the people in the county flee the county. Most of the buildings are burned or destroyed. And so the whole story of the Meck Dec would have been entirely forgotten, or best sort of a footnote or curiosity in local history because of all these events that happened. But in about 1819, various people throughout the what's now the American Republic, are debating who should get credit for the American Revolution. And the people in Massachusetts say, this is all about the Boston Tea Party, it's Samuel Adams, it's John Adams, this is a Massachusetts story. And the people in Virginia say, no, this is Thomas Jefferson and Yorktown, the American Revolution is a triumph of Virginia. And some of the local, and some of the local North Carolina people say, well, you may not have heard of this, but we actually declared independence from Great Britain in May of 1775. And like myself, 250 years later, or others, most everyone in the country said, you're making this up. We've never heard of this at all. And they said, no, it's true. And they said, we'll produce evidence. So they produced a number of things. First, they find a copy of the Meck Dec story rolled up in a series of old pamphlets in one of the surviving revolutionist home. He said, all the other papers have been lost. We found this. It's undated. It is anonymous. It's not clear who wrote it or when. And they said, it doesn't matter. It's clearly authentic. And it tells the story of the Meck Dec, the same story I just related to you. And he publishes this in the Raleigh Register of 1819. And it's called A Copy in a Hand Unknown because no one knows where it's come from. But the people in Mecklenburg say, it doesn't matter. It's clearly authentic. Although we can't validate who wrote it. It doesn't matter. It's a story that we all know here and share in the community. This newspaper finds its way to retired President John Adams. And he is very excited when he sees this in the paper. And he writes a letter to his old frenemy, Thomas Jefferson, in which he says a number of things, the most important of which was the genuine sense of America at that moment was never expressed so well before, nor since. But he also intimates that Jefferson must have seen this paper and perhaps had copied from it or hidden it up. So it's a very passive-aggressive, snarky letter to Thomas Jefferson. In fact, John Adams writes to others privately accusing Jefferson outright of plagiarism. One of his letters says, Mr. Jefferson must have seen this in the time of it, for he's copied the spirit, the sense, and its expressions verbatim. So Adams thinks, I've finally got the goods on Jefferson, who I've never liked, and this is the opportunity to really stick it to him. Jefferson, meanwhile, was not very impressed with this. He writes a reply to Adams, a very lengthy reply, very thoughtful reply, in which he makes several arguments to the effect of no historians that we know have ever heard of this. I'd never heard of it in the time. It seems unlikely it would happen. How would this have gone on with no one and gotten no national publicity? And he concludes, you seem to think it genuine, but I believe it's spurious. Although Jefferson remains open to the possibility that it could have happened, but he says, unless more solemn proof is produced, I must remain a disbeliever in the apocryphal gospel. So the Jefferson-Adams debates kicks off a whole national debate of whether this is true or not. So the North Carolinians are like, it's absolutely true, and Jefferson stole from it. The Virginians are like, you North Carolinians are making this whole story up to get credit you don't deserve. And to settle this controversy, the governor of North Carolina summons a committee to look into this and write a report. And so he does. They write a report in 1831, and they go find the eyewitnesses. And they have 12 to 13 eyewitnesses, and they're very good eyewitnesses. They're Presbyterian ministers, they're Revolutionary War veterans, they're legitimate people in the community, and they all tell more or less the same story, that the Meck Dec is real. So at that point, the Meck Decers are winning, and the argument is really on their side. And then the next chain of things that happens is that as historians are debating the truth of this and looking for other documents and evidence and so forth, they find in the Charleston Library this piece of paper. And it's a newspaper from called the South Carolina Gazette and Country Journal from June of 1775. And it's from a committee town in Mecklenburg County. And it's a series of lengthy resolutions. Well, what are these? Because they don't look or sound like anything like what the Meck Dec is supposed to sound like. They don't say we're free and independent. They say nothing of what the eyewitnesses sort of described it at, and they have a different date on them. The Meck Dec story happens on May 20th. These resolutions are dated May 31st. So what are these? Well, no one knows. So if you're a skeptic of the story, if you're a Virginian or a Bostonian, you say, this is all that happened. So this is legit. We can't disprove this for sure. You found it in the newspaper. But all of your eyewitnesses are misremembering this piece of paper, which is interesting, and conflating it in their own minds with a grander Declaration of Independence 50 years after the fact, and they're just confused. If you're a pro-Meck Dec person, you say, no, this is circumstantial evidence of the whole story. On May 20th, they declared independence, and 11 days later, they established this government. And these are related incidences, but this is proof of the truth of the overall story. And that's where the battle lines remain to this day. Meanwhile, in Charlotte, we didn't care. So we said, we're celebrating this anyway. So we put the date on the state seal. It's on the state flag. We had a number of commemorations. We had President Taft in 1909, Wilson in 1916. That's a great picture of them. Eisenhower in 1953, and Gerald Ford in 1975. And we'll talk in a little bit about what we're doing for the 250th, which is coming up in 2 weeks, which is going to be great too. Meanwhile, the entire story basically sort of fizzles out in the sort of 80s and 90s periods. A lot of people moved to town, not from this area. People just kind of lose interest in the story for a variety of reasons, as they do in local history, I would say, or national history anyway. So that's kind of when we got involved and just thought it was kind of fun. And started to sort of bring it back. And since then, and I'll conclude with this, we've had a number of, as I've talked about, we have a number of projects we've done. We've had the Captain Jack image has gotten a real push locally with the soccer teams and the breweries and so forth, and the Liberty Walk and the projects we're doing with the statues. So that's Meck Dec in, look at that, 15 minutes.
Very well done. Woo! Very well. That's impressive. I wanted to point out that John Short recently wrote for the Ledger. Excuse me.
Sorry.
Lost the mic down. Maybe I'll just hold it. John just recently wrote a column for, he pens the historical heavyweights feature in the Ledger, and he wrote about James Jack recently. So, yeah. That was an incredible, masterful job of distilling. I wanted to ask you one thing, Scott, is talk about, and again, as a prop, I brought John's book. It's incredible. The type in it is. There's so much information packed into this.
Right.
It's quite amazing. But tell me about writing this book. How long it took you, and I believe the last chapter is called Occam's Razor. And your take, if you don't mind.
No. So when we started the group, we would be asked to do speaking events or talk on the radio or write content for the website. Or now it'd be social media, which didn't exist at the time. And so for whatever reason, I became the regimental historian of the group. And so I'd had all this information, and there's so much information. You know, when I'd first learned about this story, you know, it wasn't something you mentioned in polite society. People are like, that's that stupid local story that no one believes in. It's like, why are we talking about this? But the more you looked into it, the more you're like, whether one can prove it comprehensively or not, there's a lot of information on it. I mean, more than any rational person would want to look into, and you don't have to because I did it for you, but, and there's a huge body of evidence for it, and there's some good arguments against it too, but because there's no one piece of paper that everyone can point to and say, that's the piece of paper, that's why we have this controversy. I should have mentioned the original documents are lost in a fire at one of the participants' homes in April of 1800. So, which they fully acknowledge. They say that the original papers are lost, but it doesn't matter. All the eyewitnesses, and then we have these circumstantial other pieces of paper. And so you shouldn't need the original because we have enough evidence. But if you want to be a stickler, you say you don't have the paper, you don't have the paper. So it took me several years, not on a full-time basis, but as we just compiled more and more information on this to sort of put it there. So at one point I said, I got to write all this down because if I get hit by a bus, no one's going to want to do this again.
And again, this is your free time, right? Because you're
my hobby job,
you're a
right.
corporate attorney and you're in your day job. So
Yeah,
this is like
it's not my
nights
day
and
job.
weekends, that kind of thing.
Yes, that's
Okay.
it. And so the Occam's razor, for me to conclude, my conclusion on this was there's too much evidence for this not to be true. So really all we're debating is what did the piece of paper say? And all of the eyewitnesses, again, who are very credible, all more or less say that it said the same thing. So why would we disbelieve them? So that's where I land on it. But you don't have the paper, and that's just life.
Sometimes you don't have the goods at hand. You have to.
That's it.
Yeah. John, I didn't know if you had anything to add in terms of.
Yeah, in terms of, and this is all from Scott's book, so I'll be parroting kind of the later chapters. But I think one thing that, just to put a finer point on kind of so what exactly happened, I think it's really important to understand the sentiment of we can call them now charlatans of the time in the Carolina backcountry. So these were folks that moved from Pennsylvania, other areas of the colonies, seeking a better life in the Charlotte region for like a lower cost of living, better weather, freedom to kind of like hang a shingle and pursue their economic interests, raise their family. If any of that sounds familiar in Charlotte now, it's still the reason people move to Charlotte. But they also didn't appreciate the oversight of the British governors who kind of had oversight of the land. There are a couple particular instances in the broader story, not the Meck Dec story, but happened years before, of friction between those colonists and the British government. One of them is called the Sugar Creek War, that amounts to like an effort of the British government to survey the land and collect taxes that the folks living here at the time didn't enjoy that because they were kind of cultivating the land, kind of creating houses and living here. All of a sudden the government shows up and says, oh, by the way, you owe us this because we measured the property. There's a skirmish, let's say, might be the way to put it. It wasn't a war. A war is kind of overdoing it. But that's one example of real contention between the charlatans of the time with the British government and oversight. The second was kind of had occurred in Uptown where the predominant, you could probably say all of the settlers were kind of Presbyterian and had settled here and were looking to establish a school for their children. They'd lived here long enough to kind of raise families. Their children were school age, and they sought to have a chartered school to teach in a Presbyterian school of thought in the area of College Street and Uptown now. That charter was rejected by the British government. So they were told by the government overseas that they could not educate their children in the way that they had sought to do that. So I think those are two really important precursors almost to the story to keep in mind, that there had been friction before the writing of the Meck Dec. Because a lot of the controversy and argument on the other side is like, why would these folks in the Carolina backcountry go to such extremes, put such extreme language of separation from the British government down on paper? And those are two reasons why. So kind of to put a bow on it with those, I think a reason to celebrate the Meck Dec and having the 250th anniversary coming up, it really speaks to kind of the frontier spirit of the area that you don't hear discussed a lot, but like really comes alive with this story. That Meck Dec is just another piece of an example of friction between the overlords from overseas and the spirit of the founding folks of Charlotte. So I think that's something to be celebrated in times like this.
One thing I think is kind of cool is just, I think it's exciting when people get kind of riled up about history. Myself, it feels like fresh and interesting to have it in the discourse. And so Curious about, and Scott, you had alluded to the fact that people seem to talk about it a little bit less, maybe in the 70s and 80s or 80s and 90s.
Right.
That sort of people, and then it has sort of resurged as people like yourself did research and wrote books and articles and things like that.
Well, I think that, yeah, and back to John's point, he's exactly right. That one of the first several chapters of the book are, for me, we're learning about the people that lived here, and they really didn't like the English government. They really didn't like the Anglican Church. And so this story only logically could have happened somewhere like this, for that matter. So it's a different story about how the celebration, which was, again, we had 1975, we had 150,000 people here celebrating, and it just kind of fallen away. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sort of Charlotte had taken the position, history was fraught with political baggage, right, in the 80s and 90s. It just was. And Charlotte had taken the perspective that we all know that we're tearing all the buildings down and we're getting away from all this. We're looking forward. We're going to be a banking financial center. Look at our shiny new stuff. And that was not a bad decision. But the upshot of that is, we lost any sort of association, I think, with history, generally speaking. And interestingly, what has really brought this back is that not only our group and what people around here are doing with this, but you have a lot of people that move here who love Charlotte, right? They come here from Ohio, they're 26 years old or whatever, and they're like, what a great city. It's obviously 5 years old. So when you give them some of this history, they completely become radicalized. They're like, this is crazy. I didn't know any of this at all. So I've noticed that a lot of the sort of new transplants here are much more energetic about it, wouldn't you say, or as energetic as sort of longtime Charlotte people were. Like, and myself included, I didn't know or really care anything about this 20 years ago, nor did anybody I know. But but we've got it into the breweries. We've got 4 different beers coming out in the next 6 weeks, all Meck Dec themed, and they've approached us on this stuff. So it's gotten a grassroots energy now that it hasn't had in a long time, which is great to see.
I think we need to talk later about the beers because I feel like there's a Ledger story in there somewhere. So that would be a great segue. I'd love to talk about how we have celebrated this in the past.
I don't know if I'm I don't know if I'm the you know a lot more about the past, but I did want to share a little personal connection with all of this. Scott, I guess I sort of buried the lead. Scott mentioned that the original Meck Dec burned in one of the signers' houses. So that signer is my 6th great uncle. So John Mignet Alexander, also related to Hezekiah Alexander. So I am the descendant of their younger sister, Elizabeth Alexander Sample. And I see we have a polk in the front row here. So I wonder if maybe we're related to, all the Alexanders and polks. And I always say you can throw a rock and hit one of us in Charlotte, anywhere. But I also want to speak to the fact that I am one of those transplants, right? So I am... my mother is from here, but I'm not from here. I moved here. I had a career in radio, and I moved here 24 years ago for work, knowing my family was from here, knowing there was some history, and I was always really interested in that and interested in genealogy and really, really especially my Charlotte family, because I'm also a 5th-generation Floridian, which is also completely unheard of. So, I wanted to know more, and it took many, many years to keep digging and digging. I didn't grow up with this Alexander history. I didn't know anything about this Meck Dec stuff, but I moved here and I also saw it was so hard to access history here. I would go to the library, in Uptown and go to the Carolina room and just talk to the historians and archivists there and say, my family's from here, I want to know more. And I would dig, and I think I had an Ancestry.com account from the day you could have an Ancestry.com. So I think I was very driven to find out information. And as soon as I understood that I was an Alexander, I was like, wow, I'm royalty. This is crazy. What? I felt like Charlotte royalty. I wanted to tell her, I'm an Alexander. Give me my crown. And then I began to, after that, as I do, I wanted to dispel all myths. And I started to really research and understand what what's this whole Scots-Irish thing? What's this, in the UK and in Europe, they say Ulster Scots. They don't say Scots-Irish there. But trying to understand what that meant. And so I think we can go back even further to John's point about this discord with the Crown and with England went way back. There was always this problem between the Highlander Scots and the Lowlander Scots, which of course the Lowlander Scots are the ones who ended up going to Ulster because they were promised a better situation. It wasn't a better situation. But they went there because they were always seeking. And I think that is, I see that through time, especially just specifically with the Alexanders because I've researched them the most. But I think a lot of these Protestant and Presbyterian Scots who came over here, the Lowlanders, they weren't playing bagpipes, they weren't walking around in kilts. They were much more like British than they were like their Highlander Scottish counterparts, but they really hated them as much as the Highlanders hated them. And so, when they went to Ulster, and that was they were growing and weaving linen. There's they had linen, flax plantations. That was quite a robust industry there. It still somewhat is. But, that didn't work out well. So, okay, let's come over, right? And then they end up settling in Maryland and Pennsylvania. And then as this tide starts to shift and it becomes more problematic for them to be in those colonies because the British are starting to put more and more laws and rules, especially on these Scots, these Lowlander Scots. They're not welcome there. And so that is how they wound up here. I mean, they just keep moving and moving and moving and seeking better and seeking better. And I say that to tie it in with the Alexanders. Like, we have Dr. Annie Alexander on the Trail of History. And she was the first licensed female physician in North Carolina at a time when women weren't doctors. It was the late 19th century. Her father sent her to Philadelphia to go to medical college at 17. My youngest daughter just turned 17 last week. That child couldn't leave my house for a week, let alone go to another state and just be alone. There's no phones. There's no TikTok. What would you do, right? So you just think about, I know it was the time, but we hear the stories that these women were spit on by the men, their counterparts that were in medical school there. They made it so difficult for them. So I like to say that because I think that's that Alexander spirit. And we talk about the spirit of Mecklenburg, and it's the Alexanders, and it's the Polks, and it's all of these Scots-Irish who came here with a vision. And then, again, they weren't afraid to fight. Like, I think that's more to the point to say that, more evidence to say, why wouldn't they stand up for freedom? What did they have to lose? They had left 2 countries. They had already left 2 colonies. They were fighting for what they thought was theirs. They came here for this. So why would they be afraid? They wouldn't be. So, yeah, that didn't answer your question, but I had to, go off and share that little tangent there. Here, you talk a little bit about the past because you know more.
Well, I think we covered some of the, the presidents. So 4 sitting American presidents had visited historically for Meck Dec Day. We had tried to get a current sitting president to come this year, which did not work out. And yeah, this was the biggest sort of thing in North Carolina for many years, which is that's part of the radicalization you get when you learn about the story, when you realize what a huge history it had and sort of how far it had sort of just kind of evaporated 40 years ago. So that's it. So, when part of my interest in writing the book was really, again, you didn't really talk about this in polite company 20 years ago because people are like, that's that weird story. And they said it's completely made up. So my goal and our group's goal was not to get too much in the weeds on let's debate every piece of evidence on this whole thing. It was more, let's move the needle from it's completely hoax back to where it needs to be and should be, frankly, in the middle, which is a great body of evidence. It's all in 1 or more books. You're all adults. You can make your mind up about it. But it's not as clear cut and or open and shut as, that didn't happen, and it's been debunked, which is kind of where it lay a while ago. So that was really the goal for us. And I think now you see the celebrations coming around. We've got a lot coming up for the 250th, obviously. I think this is the generational opportunity to really make this the biggest thing it's been for 50 years. So, you have anything?
Yeah,
just to add to that, I think that's an exciting opportunity of it being the 250th anniversary and the things that you have to mention and ways we're celebrating, is that a lot of other communities around the world and in the United States have sources of civic pride that they celebrate that have kind of spurious histories related to them. But so, for example, one example I like to give in Tampa, Florida, they have a Gasparilla festival that is essentially Mardi Gras with pirates. That is, so far as I can tell, like not based in history at all. Like there's very little. It is a legend, very much a legend, but it is also a kind of chamber of commerce, like tourism event, and kind of you have people travel from all over. There's parades, there's celebrations. The community gets really excited about it. It's something you do learn about in school. So I think I bring that up because historical accuracy is not necessarily a prerequisite to being a source of civic pride. So the 250th anniversary of the Meck Dec is almost an opportunity to reset. And for a lot of the transplants that are maybe learning about this for the first time, they say, hey, that's a great idea. We should celebrate more about that and build some momentum to what it was when it was a bigger celebration than Independence Day, July 4th, for 100 or so years. So that's kind of an opportunity to maybe reframe, and it sounds like the reasons that you wrote the book as well, kind of an opportunity like, hey, let's not call balls and strikes about like what evidence can we produce in the 21st century versus not. Let's make it about the source of the prize. Why did this happen? Let's learn the story. Why did these people feel this way of kind of fierce independence? And let's celebrate that spirit, the spirit of Mecklenburg, rather than kind of the accuracy of all the claims.
So what will be happening this month?
You want to go first?
Sure.
Scott and I will not be sleeping this month is basically. So the first thing we have so many things. This coming Saturday, we will have the Mecklenburg 250 Festival on the Trail of History. So it will be at the site of the Captain Jack statue. We are partnering the Trail of History and Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation because they are our partners for the Trail of History. We're partnering. This is actually our third annual history festival. So we're excited because people before 3 years ago, there weren't history festivals in Mecklenburg County. And again, it speaks to that, like where history hasn't been valued in, probably 40-ish years or so, right? We are working really hard to help history become something powerful in our community. And this is our opportunity to get out here and get to do all of these different things. So that's the first thing we're doing. You speak to your other things before we talk about the big thing.
This could be another field trip, actually, which is on Monday, we're having a panel discussion at Town Brewery, and they're launching their First in Freedom brew, which is going to be really fun. Chaz Fagan, who's a sculptor in town, and myself, and David Fleming, who wrote a very good book also on the subject, if you haven't picked it up, called Who's Your Founding Father? ? It's a very fun read about the Meck Dec story. So that's Monday. The History Festival is on Saturday. And then the week following, we have our bike ride from OMB on where we go downtown and we stop at the Jack statue and do little lectures. And then Monday, this is an interesting one. I'll be brief about it, but we're working with the North Carolina Supreme Court, Justice Newby specifically, and the Federal Court of Appeals here. And they have been sponsoring for 3 months a moot court tournament for high school students around the state, and put together teams. And so on Monday at the federal courthouse, we're going to have the remaining 4 or 8 teams start at 9 a.m. and debate. And then the topic is the veracity of the Meck Dec story. Sorry, I should have led with that. Yes, you're like, why is he talking about this? So that'll be really good. And then the 2 teams will compete, I think, at 3 p.m. in front of the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, who is a Meck Dec nut. He loves this story. We've had him down to speak about this. As soon as we had this idea and gave it to him, he's like, we're doing that. That's a great plan. I see some of my legal colleagues here. So that's on Monday, the debate at in front of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And then Tuesday's the big day. We've got the noon commemoration on Tuesday the 20th. And then we have a dinner we do at Old Mecklenburg Brewery that evening, a private dinner, which sold out for good or bad in about 5 hours. And we bring in a historian to speak. And then that's kind of it. There's a couple ancillary stuff, but those are the big ones.
Can people come and watch the arguments at this part?
Absolutely. It's open to the public. So
And the bicycle tour with the lectures, do you have to do you have to be on bicycle for that?
You got to be on bike for that. Okay. Yeah. Afraid so. Also, but you can go to our website, may20society.org, and all of the events are listed on there. So.
And you should speak about some of our special things at the noon commemoration. Okay, I guess I'll speak about that. So we are, for the first time, I don't know, maybe in 50 years, I'm not sure, we are closing Trade and Try On for the noon commemoration. I don't know if any of you have been uptown anytime recently, but it's busy there, and to get a closure for Trade and Try On is quite exciting. So we'll have the entire square. We'll be using the entire square for the event. We have some special music we're working on. We have reenactors that have been working really hard the last couple of months to put on a well-scripted reenactment of the creation of the Meck Dec, the reading of the Meck Dec. So we're really excited about this year. The Charlotte Museum of History is also opening, there's so many things, they're also opening a Meck Dec exhibit on the 20th that I think will go for a little while. It'll last for 6 months, right? So some really neat, relics and archives in there, and I haven't seen it, but we're excited to see that. So that's off Shamrock in East Charlotte. That's something, and I do want to add something. I'm going to go back a little bit and just to speak to something interesting that I didn't find out about until last year when we talk about the resolves, because when we talk about the Meck Dec, it's like easy to be like, well, right, if people want to be, but you can't, Scott talked about, you can't argue with the resolves, like it's in newspapers, it's there. But what's also really interesting is that it was in the, I think, 1920s, it was put into a book that I believe either Congress or the Senate created called the Founding Documents of America, like the documents that made America, and it was chapter number 2. Was the Mecklenburg Resolves. And it was the only founding document from North Carolina that got into that book. Not Halifax, not the Halifax Resolves, the Mecklenburg Resolves, the only North Carolina document. And I bring that up because it made people really mad. If you go back and you read some of the stuff that started where like UNC, like Chapel Hill and the state of North Carolina, that is when some real pressure started to come out to say, hey, these historians, these, college people, university people are saying, like, can't believe this. And David goes a bit into that in his book as well, but really the Jeffersonians were really pushing that narrative of, hey, this isn't real. So they kept trying to kind of throw facts out there. But I think people were just mad that it got into this national book from, with the White House seal on the cover, and nothing else in North Carolina made it in there. But that's a pretty big deal, and it was actually the first document once the war started. I think the document that was in there before the resolves was maybe 1774 or something. So I just like to share that with people because I think it's another kind of check mark to say, hey, there was a time that all of this was really important, and our county's name really meant something, and hopefully we can do all of this and continue to do the work to get back to that.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. The Charlotte Ledger podcast is produced by Lindsay Banks. For more information about the Charlotte Ledger or to subscribe to one of our newsletters, visit thecharlotteledger.com.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.